hour and a half, but we wanted to leave enough time for some discussion at the end of the call today, but wanted to kind of rally the troops together here before folks really head into the thick of request for proposal season for FY25 already, even though we are still in FY23. But we wanted to kind of get everybody together, have this call, especially given that we have a number of new coordinators on, give an opportunity of those folks to ask questions of some of the more seasoned coordinators and have some group discussion about this whole process within NFHP of putting out an RFP and collecting proposals. So just in terms of kind of what we're going to walk through today, we're going to cover the specific scoring rubric for the FY25 FHP application process. And then Kate is going to talk through some of the elements of the database and reminders and things for your, as you go into your RFP development and process. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different methods that FHPs use. Folks use a variety of like softwares and tools to collect their actual proposals from partners. We're going to talk through that a little bit and then just have some open time for discussion. So does anybody have questions before we kind of dive in? I want to just pause there, make sure we're good. Okay. It looks like Holly, you might be off mute. So just as a heads up, your little thing keeps lighting up for me. All right, so I'm going to talk first about the scoring rubric overview. So folks who were in their coordinator positions for the last go round of funding, you saw that we implemented this new FHP score report card, we called it. Hopefully that didn't induce too much anxiety for folks calling it a report card, but we wanted to really get kind of further chip away at the transparency of scoring. Once you all submit your project lists to the board, they go through a review process, and then the board provides FHPs some feedback there, and that helps determine your FHP allocation once we get our NFHP budget. So for folks who are new, hopefully this is kind of going to give you a little bit of a sense of how this process works. I know a couple of the coordinators who are newer were hired on right around the time that this was happening. So if this is your first year going through this process, I would highly encourage you to work really closely with Kate and other staff, but also connect with some of the more seasoned coordinators who have been through this process before. They're a great resource for you, and also the Fish and Wildlife Service coordinators, they would also be another really good resource for those new coordinators. So stepping through the FY25 rubric, I want to start off with a few caveats. So this has been an active discussion in the last couple of weeks with the board review team that went through the review last year. So I want to just huge caveat that this isn't final just yet. The only thing that may change is the scoring scales that you'll see on the next slide. So by and large, the large scoring bins where you have the different scores will not change. The smaller kind of more fine point details within those is what may shift in the next couple of weeks. But we anticipate finalizing this really soon with that team and sending out the final report card template so that you all have those final in hand as you go through your RFP process. To highlight a couple of the changes before I show you the actual updated rubric, changes from last year include that we have kind of simplified the ACE Act hard requirements section, which you'll see on the next slide as the blue categories. And we've had those all now separated out so that each one stands alone and each one is worth 10 points. Just makes it more streamlined, easier to interpret. Before, in last year's scoring rubric, they were kind of lumped together in a couple of different ways. And so this year we kind of wanted to just simplify that and streamline that and make that more straightforward. We've also added 5 points for providing project status updates. So in last year's, this was more of a yes or no criteria that didn't actually weigh into the FHP scores at all. but we heard really positive review from board review team members saying they really liked seeing those project updates as part of the FHP applications. So we've added some points into the overall application where FHPs can earn points for providing those project status updates. And then the overall message that we heard from this review team in reflecting back on the FY24 process was that folks wanted less weight on the hard ACE-ACT criteria and more weight in other parts of the scoring section. So basically more flexibility of board members to really reward FHPs that went above and beyond in their applications, that put together a really thorough application. They wanted more room to allow those FHPs to shine and to give those really, really excellent applications more points. And so you'll see that that part of the application has more weight to it. I feel like there's a word missing from that bullet. No, the overall package score. That's what there was a category for kind of your overall package quality, and this has a higher point value in this year's or for FY25 scoring. So I am going to basically show the next slide has what the new FHP report card will look like. And yes, thank you, Jason, for chiming in on the chat. Reviewers also wanted to be able to give credit for FHP activities that fall outside of a lot of these project funding elements. Things like outreach and education really stood out for board members, and so this was another place that folks wanted an opportunity to give additional points. Thanks, Jason. So up next, I'm just going to show the updated, revised scoring rubric or FHP report card template, however you want to think about it. And again, these caveats all still stand, and I've tried to highlight a couple of things that are important as we walk through. So I'm going to step through this and take some time to walk through this, since I know we have a fair number of new coordinators on who may not have been through this process yet. So like I mentioned, this was a new thing that we used for the first time last year, and it was to really help provide FHPs some direct feedback from the board review team about how your FHP application performed. And, you know, it's a report card, so somewhat straightforward there. So you'll see that in this blue section, the blue section reflects all of the hard ACE-ACT requirements. And so these are the requirements that are must-dos in terms of the ACE-ACT. And so you'll hear us talking about hard ACE-ACT requirements and soft ACE-ACT requirements. And that's the legislation that codified this program in 2020. And so there are some criteria that are in the legislation that are sort of nice to haves and additional great things that our projects can do, but they are not viewed as strict must-haves. And so those fall into this kind of orangey area here in the soft requirements. So back up to the hard requirement section, as you can see, we've basically, this language hasn't really changed at all. We've just separated out the individual hard requirements. So you'll see there is a bin for summaries of project sponsor experience. You'll see that there's a bin for measurable ecological benefits. You'll see goals and objectives, and then full match for the overall FHP proposal. And then you also see the one-to-one, oh, whoops, I think this is duplicated here. Yes, this is duplicated. This should have a different, sorry about that. So we'll adjust this before we send out the slides so that this is correct. But basically each of these bins or each of these rows reflects one of the hard requirements in the ACE-ACT, and each of them has equal weighting at 10 points each. So this whole section is worth 50 points, which is half of your 100 points. Let me pause there before I move on to the next section and just double check my chat here too. Does anyone have any questions on what I've talked through so far? Yeah, Jennifer, go ahead.
Thanks. Will the board's review committee have the option to give you like 5 points, or is it a 0 or a 10?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and that's the point on here that is needing to be adjusted. So you'll see that the first the first 3 rows are all a sliding scale of 0 to 10. So you can score anywhere between a 0 and 10 based on how the board reviewers think that you're meeting that criteria. For the match requirement for satisfying the overall proposal, except for tribal projects, that is going to be a 0 or a 10. So that is going to be you did meet the match or you did not meet the match. And we want to emphasize here the tribal projects in the ACE Act are exempt from that one-to-one match requirement. However, if you bring in a project in your application that does have that one-to-one match and it helps you to meet that match, that project will be counted when we go through the tallying up to see whether that one-to-one match has been met. I think I saw Jennifer, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I think I saw Therese.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I can't unraise my hand. I'll figure it out. Anyway, so Alex, as I remember the spreadsheet, so we don't have to indicate now for each project if there's one-to-one match? Is it just going to be overall across all our projects? Is that what that means?
So when you go to enter your projects in the database, it will still be collected on a project by project basis. But what we are doing for the board team review is rolling that up and calculating that for them. And so that's part of what Kate does behind the scenes is once all of your projects are entered, we go through and we basically autofill what your match ratio is so that board member reviewers have that in hand. They're not doing any of that manually. That's provided for them based on your match that you've entered for each project individually.
Gotcha. But so we still need to indicate each project individually. Okay, got it. But it'll be in the database. Yep.
Exactly. Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. I see Debbie's hand, and I also want to get to Tim's question in the chat. Tim asks, if something is a hard requirement, doesn't that mean if you don't get all 50 points, you don't qualify for funding? So I would say that, Tim, because we have these sliding scales in here, those are allowing the board some flexibility, and we're building that in intentionally per their request to be able to reward partnerships who are really putting forward a very strong, clear proposal that includes all of these things. But I would say if you scored a 0 in any or all of these categories for any particular projects, those projects may not go forward and be put forward on the list to the project list for review by the Secretary of Interior. And I think Kate might want to chime in on this as well. Kate?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And last year, some folks didn't feel, in filling out the database, didn't fill out some of those fields. And so there was definitely a feedback loop of, hey, this is a hard requirement. You need to fill that in. But it's more of some people answer questions really well, good quality, and some don't. And so just trying to be clear about, how you're answering these questions to get the full 50 points. But I agree, if you aren't answering one of these questions and you get a 0, that's not great. The one-to-one match obviously is challenging, but we will definitely make sure that you all have done your best to answer these. Not trying to hide anything or sneak anything by anybody, but they are important.
So Tim, it looks like Tim has a follow-up about coordination proposals. So the coordination is at this point in time not exempt from that one-to-one match. So we do ask that partnerships do their best to show how they meet that. But as this is described here in the scoring, it is rolling up all of your match. And so any places where you have a little bit more match, that may help cover places where you don't have as much to meet that one-to-one. So I would say that we are interpreting as much flexibility as we can in this, but it is collected on a project by project basis in the database, and then we roll that up to a higher level. Debbie, go ahead. Thanks for waiting.
Yeah, great. Hey, thanks, guys. Really appreciate you walking through this. This is great. So, Alex, I heard you kind of say something at the end about the tribal projects that they don't necessarily count in this hard requirement for the one-to-one match across all projects. But then you said you guys were tracking whatever match might be coming in. And I was wondering, can you go into that a little bit more? Because one of the things that as I've read the ACE Act, it seems to me that the way that the language reads that they interpret, so say a tribal project is getting some additional federal funding. In the ACE Act, it seems to want to make that additional federal funding match funding. So I've been kind of confused sometimes when I've been trying to report out from some of these projects. So can you guys go into a little bit more detail there, like what you mean by how you're going to be counting the tribal projects and the overall, just so I'm a little more clear.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie, for the question. I think that's going to require a little bit of a finer point to discuss with the board review team. Specifically, your question about is additional federal funding going to be able to be counted as match? I don't know that we've talked through that in fine detail just yet. I mainly wanted to highlight that the tribal projects not having the one-to-one non-federal match will not count against you if you don't have that because they are exempt through the ACE Act. But I see that Kate wants to chime in too, so I'll let her add to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Debbie. Something I did observe, and I'm not calling out any partnerships because I actually don't remember which one, where some folks may have not entered the match, and they proposed 50,000 for NFHP for a tribal project and didn't enter any federal, non-federal, any match. And we still want to know that information, but as we're looking at the full package of your NFHP proposed projects versus your non-federal match, which is supposed to be one-to-one, a tribal project could bring that score down because it doesn't have to have those non-federal dollars matching it. That said, if it has federal match and you enter that is excellent, and it kind of boosts what we talk about as leveraged funds for NFHP. So I encourage you to enter it into the database, but I'm not sure about that nuanced about whether or not leveraged federal matched tribal funds could be considered match. I'm not sure. We definitely need clarification on that. But I encourage you all to fill out the match and leveraged information. And just because it's a tribal project, it's not going to bring your score down, basically, is the point of that.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So I think, Debbie, there might be a specific follow-up there just with regard to your question about federal funds being used as match, but either way, the database has been set up so that you can indicate the source of those funds. We just wanted to make sure that folks understood that if tribal projects didn't have match, that they're not going to be counted against that score for the match.
Great. Thanks a bunch.
Okay, and then, I see Kevin, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to clarify or make sure I understand. So as a partnership, the match, non-fed match needs to be one-to-one in order to get 10 points on that as an entire package of proposals.
Yes.
And how do you guys test out what you select then if you select a project that is not meeting that requirement then as an individual project?
So that's where that flexibility is really helpful for the board review team. So if a partnership puts forward, let's say 5 projects, and 4 of those projects meet the match and 1 of them doesn't, if any of your other 4 projects go above and beyond, that can assist in that place where you don't meet that non-federal match. So we're really using the most amount of flexibility in interpreting this to allow that additional match to kind of help cover in areas where you may not meet that one-to-one. Does that make sense?
Yes, that helps. Thank you.
Okay. So Max had a follow-up in the chat about whether or not a project could still get funded. That is kind of a question for much further down the road in this process. So I think we might come back to that just to clarify how this process plays out over basically an 18-month time period. And so by the time you're actually at the point where you're, entering contracts, or Fish and Wildlife Service is setting up contracts with projects, usually the conditions have changed by then, but I think let's address that a little bit later. I want to continue to move through here, and I'm trying to keep an eye on time, so I give Kate enough time. Okay, and then there's one more question. Yeah, so I'm hoping I'm being clear here, because I'm seeing a lot of questions about match. So ultimately, each project at an individual level should have one non-federal one-to-one match. However, we are utilizing as much flexibility as we can in interpreting the ACE Act language here and rolling up all of the projects at a partnership level to assess your one-to-one match. So in any places where you have above and beyond that one-to-one, document it when you put that project into the database, because it can help boost your score if you do not have one-to-one non-federal match for another project. But like you'll see in this FY24 year, not all of the FHPs were able to meet the non-federal match for their operational funds. However, you're still all getting those operational funds. So I just want to make that clear. I don't know if Kate, do you have anything additional you want to say about that? Hopefully I'm speaking accurately on that.
Yeah, I mean, the board review team is still looking at each project to see, do they meet one-to-one match? That said, there are some really great projects that don't have that and might be just below that. And so this is where the board review team is trying to have the most flexibility in benefiting you all. So yeah, I think Alex put it, this isn't saying, okay, any project will do, doesn't need to have one-to-one match. That is still in the ACE Act, that the Fish and Wildlife Service still wants to see that. But in your score, if you have one project like your operations fund that doesn't have one-to-one match, you're not going to get 0 points if the rest of your projects are bringing it up. So it's just trying to help the FHPs as a whole.
Thanks, Kate. And Jason, Kate just touched on it as well, but Jason raised a very important point in the chat. So for those new coordinators who are still kind of wrapping their heads around how NFHP works, we are not a standalone funding operation. Our funding comes from Congress to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service has their own layer of review that comes beyond the board level review. So when it comes to Max's question of, well, is that project going to get funded? We don't know until that goes all the way through the Secretary of Interior's review process and they approve a specific list of projects for the FHP partnership. So it's this layered process of you guys bring forward your project lists, it goes to the board, and then the board submits a list to the Secretary of Interior, and ultimately nothing can get funded unless it is approved by the Secretary of Interior. All right, I want to move on from this just to wrap up going through the last components of this scoring report card before I hand it over to Kate to cover the next couple of items. So you'll see here that this last row in the blue section, this is just a yes or no on whether or not you requested operational funds. That's just purely a data collection point. That's not that does not play into your score at all. And then there's a blank here for us to auto fill in your match ratio, as we talked about earlier. So this orange section is the soft requirements piece, and you'll see that these middle scoring scale, this middle scoring scale column is all highlighted in yellow, and that's because these specific individual pieces are still the components that are in progress to finalize with the board review team. So I just want to highlight here that I don't anticipate these scores far on the right side of the screen to change. I think the breakdown between 50, 20, and 30 will stay the same. But what you may see change in the next couple of weeks is this sliding scale of exactly what those finer points look like. So we wanted to give you this as soon as it was close to final so that you can have this data, but just know that you may see some changes in this scale column in the middle. So the soft requirements are all outlined in the ACE Act. Those are all also specifically called out in the database. So for new coordinators who don't know what those are going to be specifically listed in the database. And those are not the must-haves for projects, but the nice-to-haves for projects. And they are not all, you know, it's not that you have to meet every single one. And so we're working through kind of what this sliding scale within the 20 points looks like. Is it a good bar to have 6 be the requirement, or do we want to have more than 6? But ultimately, I think we want to make it, you know, easy for folks to meet that. But we know that every project can't meet every single one of these soft criteria. So these are still in progress. And then you'll see this last section is the green section, and this is the place where board members wanted a little bit more flexibility to reward FHPs that put together really excellent packages. And so you'll see that now there's a higher point value for the overall package application, which is the last row. So that's now worth 15 points, 10 points for a clear justification for operational support funding. And then we've also added in those points for the project update, the project status updates. So that's that 5-point value. So the total points still 100, but you'll see that the weighting has shifted quite a bit from last year, where this blue section was weighted by a lot more, this green section was weighted less. So that's the main adjustment that you'll see from last year to FY25. All right, I think let's go ahead and shift gears. Kate is going to, before we jump over to her slides, she is going to do a quick preview of the dashboard that the board review team used to review your applications, just to kind of help everybody see where we are making the connections and where this database is really, you know, the rubber is meeting the road and we're getting to use it, and it is very exciting, and board member reviewers were really excited to use this. So I will let Kate take over. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, we just wanted to show you what and you all have a different version of this, but the board review team used when they were reviewing the proposed projects for FY24, and it will be the same for FY25. They used this dashboard, and what I wanted to point out to you all is that when you enter certain fields in the database for a certain project, and this just happens to be a Kenai Peninsula project, but you will see that the board review team went through, they looked at the project sponsor, each of the hard criteria, and they read for each project the content of each of these, both for the hard criteria, hard requirements, and the soft requirements. And so just to be super upfront that what you're entering into the database for your proposed project is being reviewed. And, you know, I'm happy to share this with you all. It's not a secret. It's all your proposed projects. But, you know, just being aware of what fields you're entering, these are all required fields in the database, are being reviewed by board members. And so we just wanted to give you a preview of that, so you could see what that means to the board review team. So if for some reason, you know, you didn't enter a response here, you know, that would be kind of one less response for, you know, those soft criteria. I think there's a total of 13 or 14. So we just wanted to point that out. I'll pause for a second and take any questions, and then I'll switch over to the PowerPoint. I don't think I see any, but I also
I'm watching
do you see
Kate.
any,
I don't
Alex?
I don't
Okay.
see any hands, so I think go ahead and throw. Oh, there's a question in the chat. Kate, did you mention that the reviewers only see the required fields?
No, they see all the fields, but what I did was really highlight. I'm saying all the hard requirements are required fields, so you couldn't submit the form without typing in a hard requirement. That said, sometimes a response was minimal or not what we were looking for, and so we did follow up. But they can see all the fields that you enter in the database, but we just try to organize them in a way so they know these are hard requirements, this is what I'm scoring, and these are soft requirements, and this is what I'm scoring. Max, does that answer your question?
We got an
Okay.
awesome in the chat, so you're all good.
Cool. And now I have to figure out how do I make this into a slideshow, Alex?
Yeah, just in the top right, click where it says slideshow.
Oh, there we go. Wow.
Perfect.
So y'all are getting ready to release your RFPs. Obviously, you've all asked to know about the scoring, but I just wanted to share some reminders about thinking about how to structure your RFP to make it the easiest for you to enter information about your projects into the database. So a couple of documents that we'll send around after, but you already all should have, is a frequently asked questions document about entering projects into the database, a data standard document which lists all the fields in the database and their character limit. So we'll make sure that you have those so you know when you're creating your RFP, if you're trying to match the RFP to the database. And I'll pause on comments about that because I know you probably do additional information too in your RFP, but if you want to try to match it and have the character limits match the database, that's great. You have that information. I also wanted to remind you that there is a database training recording. I did a database training in early August with a few new coordinators, and so that is available, and we're happy to share that with you. And I'm almost done with a giant document for how to enter projects into the database. So actually a written document with all this information lined out. So we'll have that to you in the next couple of months so you can have it way in advance of leading up to the proposed projects, even though I know many of you have already been in the database and working in it, but just to have on hand. So those are just some documentation and things that you should have at your disposal to help you design your RFP, to make it easiest to report to NFHP. So just some specific considerations, like I mentioned, the character limits. If you allow your proposers to write, 10 paragraphs, and then you need to condense it down to 1,500 characters or 250 words, might just be something to consider, how much work you want to put down into condensing what they submit versus asking the proposer to do that, the project sponsor to do that. And that is up to you to manage, but just a consideration. And there's some in the database, there are some drop-down menus where there's standardized responses. If you want, you can use those same standardized responses in your RFP. For example, the recreational fishing responses are standardized, where you can say it's not applicable. There's a few different options. You could use those same standard responses in your RFP and then allow for an open text explanation. And then when you go to enter into the database, it's all right there. Making sure that you have the ASAC criteria responses in your RFP. I know this all might be stating the obvious, but just, I just wanted to outline this, especially because we have a significant number of new coordinators on board, making sure that your RFP aligns with the ASAC criteria that you're going to be scored on. I'm going to show this in a minute, but just considering your budget templates. I know a couple of partnerships that I've talked to, they actually request 2 different budget templates. One of them is, a project budget, and the other budget template, and I'll show you an example in a minute, makes it really easy to get the information that NFHP requires. So the organization, I'll go into that in a minute and I'll show you an example. And then also photos. One of the things that happened last year was a lot of folks were receiving photographs in a PDF. And then it wasn't very easy for them to add the photos to the database because they need to be in JPEG format. And so just might be one consideration if you'd like images to go into the database cleanly, requesting the photos from your project sponsor in separate JPEGs would be helpful. And this happened for quite a few people. They were bummed that would be a lot of work to save each individual photograph from a PDF into a JPEG format and then enter it into the database. So just might be something to think about before. So I will pull up this budget template. So thanks to Therese, and then also to California Fish Passage Forum. I'm going to share a couple examples of this NFHP oriented budget where they ask for the organization, both the cash, federal and non-federal, in-kind, federal, non-federal, and whether or not the funding is secured or pending. And then also, to note if it's tribal, I added this column, but
Hey,
this
Kate,
is basic. Yep.
Could you zoom in on that quite a bit? It's a little bit hard to see. Thank you. That's better.
Yep. Thanks. So I just wanted to give you all this example of trying to lay out how your sponsors collect information on the budget to make it easier to enter into the database. As you can imagine, this is an example of Winty's full budget, but it might be a little bit hard if you just have a budget like this to pull out information that NFHP is looking for in terms of the amount of funding requested. So, it might be hard to ask for 2 budgets. You may all be doing this. I may be stating the obvious, but I just wanted to put it out there that I know that the funding section is probably the most time consuming to enter into the database. So any way that you can streamline that by having your sponsors submit information for each project, I think is helpful. And here's an example from California Fish Passage Forum, similar, the name of the partner organization. They have a drop-down menu with the type of match, federal, non-federal, or tribal, which matches the database exactly. Cash contributions, the contribution secured, in kind, and then total. So, I'm happy to provide a couple of examples for you. So that is just a couple of examples that I wanted to give you as a reminder that you do have to enter in specific information into the database and what would be most helpful. So I'm going to go back and just pause there because I see there's quite a bit of maybe a couple chats and see if there's any questions. So Therese commented that we found that we need both spreadsheets in order to tease apart the project budget and who is contributing what, especially for really big projects. They also tracked for secured versus pending funding, which is great. And you can also report that in the NFHP database. Joe, I see you came on the camera. Do you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah, well, I think Therese raised a good question that actually for me, it's all to say for me, by far the most time consuming part of this is taking the whatever 1,000-word, entries that MGLP was collecting for each of the relevant sections and trimming them down to the NFHP character limits. And I'm wondering whether there's been any consideration, like how much thought went into those character limits and whether there's opportunity to relax those character limits. And so is that a data storage issue, or is it a question of the reviewers not wanting to read a bunch of information, or is there opportunity for a discussion about relaxing those character limits? Because that would allow me to ask my applicants for that information at the level that I need it to make a good decision, and then just copy and paste it straight in without having to rewrite their narratives.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a challenging balance. Do the board reviewers need to review it at that level? It is a lot of information. It's also, right now the database schema to update that, to update the character limit is one of the most challenging things. You basically have to redo those. And when I created the character limits, it was trying to find a balance between allowing there to be enough information, but not so much, because it is a database, and formatting and all that if you enter paragraphs and paragraphs of information into a database, it actually throws a lot of errors, and it's more challenging to review and actually get the information. So we tried to separate things out into different categories to make it easier to review. And just having that much text in a database is not really best practice for 10 different fields to have that much text. And it becomes really hard to compare across all these projects. So if there are a couple fields that are huge problems all the time, yes, I think we can talk about that. But increasing every open text to be, and 10,000 characters would be just a lot of information. And I think bring in a lot of room for error. So I totally hear you, and I'm not sure the best way necessarily to do that. I can speak for PMEP's perspective, where there are certain places where Joan does ask the sponsor to provide a summary, and Joan unfortunately is on vacation today, but she does ask them to write a long narrative and then a shorter version. And sometimes those shorter versions actually end up being easier to digest for some people than the narrative. So I'll pause there, and Alex, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and thanks, Therese and Joe, for the question. I because this is something that I think affects everybody in the RFP process, and because there is this balance of, we have board reviewers who are reviewing this times 20. So basically take what your FHP is doing and multiply it by 20. We're trying to do our best to balance distilling that information into something that's easily digestible. So if every FHP puts forward 10 projects, it's 200 projects times however many fields. So it's quite a lift for the board reviewers. But given that this has come up a fair amount, and that this was the first year of doing this, and I'm hearing that there's definitely some room for discussion, I would love to hear what folks propose as a possible solution to this problem, because I know that the steering committees want a different level of information than the board may want. So I think this is a good opportunity for some discussion among the partnerships about what may be the happy medium there of shorter versus longer application fields.
Yeah, and specific fields, because just opening them all up, it is no small feat of work to basically do that. And so I just want to be thoughtful in considering which ones. And there is one field that everybody runs into an error for. So I'm aware of that one, sponsor expertise. Everybody pretty much, I think almost everybody here has run into an issue with that. And so You know, I think that's because people enter it in differently, but yeah, totally aware which fields, and if there are a couple places where we could add maybe additional longer narratives for you to be able to enter, but just knowing that the board review team does need to kind of have this distilled down. And so, yeah, finding a balance, but we can definitely work together. And I know, Joe, you've sent comments on the database to me. So, you know, I'm definitely open to hearing that.
I think
Thanks, I really appreciate that.
I see Sarah's got her hand up. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe you're getting to this later when you're going to touch on some of the forms or software maybe that folks are using to bring in applications. But I'm curious if you were giving thought to whether our future might include applications being made directly into the database and kind of queued there somehow for us to review, so that, you know, then we're not spending so much time rewriting, but could kind of focus the coordinator time on supporting applicants transforming their info into the types of fields, you know, that we ultimately need. Maybe some folks already are doing some things like that, but
yeah, and I'm definitely going to cover, yes, we're considering it, and I'm going to get into that in detail, I think, in a couple slides. But this, I had actually wanted to do it this year and test it with a couple partnerships, but because of these potential issues, I feel like that needs full support. And, you know, just like any system, there needs to be technical support for whoever's entering the information. And so I think it is nice for us all to have a year or two under our belt of using it. So not only can I provide technical support if folks are having issues, but the coordinators are also familiar with the system. But yeah, I'm going to get to that soon and talk a little bit more about that. But 100%, that would be an amazing goal to have this all streamlined. We just have to figure out the best way to do it and meet everybody's needs. So I'm seeing comments, trying to read them. I see Joe's comments about methods. Yeah, Steve, I appreciate your comment about that in terms of the number of projects. And Heidi, yes, I see that you're also entering into FIS. And this is a totally different conversation, but just so you all know, there are active conversations going on between folks working on FIS and the NFHP staff. So Daniel, myself, and Jason have been talking with folks who are doing the database stuff at FIS. And I know that that is a double effort that not everybody has to do, but some of you do. And so stay tuned, because we'll probably pull those Fish and Wildlife Service folks into a conversation. But we do want to try and reduce that. And the ideal situation in the future is that you enter it into the NFHP database and we create an export for the FIS database. And that is then imported. And that is the ultimate goal. That'll probably take a couple years, but that is the ultimate goal, to try and reduce that. And I see Louise has her hand up.
Yeah, you skipped over my comment about making sure that folks were aware that this is kind of like a two-layered proposal process, because, you know, you're entering information into the project database. Yeah, we have FIS stuff that needs to be entered, but like when we put an agreement in place, contracting has their own like proposal, so to speak. It's called narrative, like a project narrative. And you've got to have specific components within that narrative that's submitted with your application in order to put the agreement in place. And I just want to make sure, you know, the applicants or the coordinators know to pass that on to their applicants that, aside from the information that's going in the database, they're also going to have to put this narrative together for the agreement if their project is selected for funding.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just to, when you submit a proposal, this is your proposal being reviewed. If selected, there will be a process of putting this agreement in place. And I think that's a really important point and just a nuance that is good to remind folks. So thanks for bringing that up. Sorry, your comment got buried. So many comments that your comment got buried.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thanks to those Fish and Wildlife Service coordinators who are doing double duty, entering all the information. So we really appreciate it. We know how much work that is, plus being out in the field and actually doing your jobs. So anything else before I move on to what we were just talking about, future plans for the NFHP database form? I don't see anything, so I'm going to keep going. Feel free to raise your hand. So yes, in an ideal world, we would use the NFHP database form for what I'm going to call public collection of proposals, because really at that point, it is a public data collection where you're putting it out for members of the public who are proposing projects to submit information. And there are a couple, definitely some considerations. This thing that was brought up about character limits, that a lot of the FHPs need more information. And so we would really need to think about that. Also, there's 20 FHPs, and I know that there's questions specific to each FHP that need to happen. And so as you can imagine, there may need to be 20 different tailored forms to get at each of your unique questions, which is a whole boatload of work. And so, I think this will be something that we'll make available, and we'll work with you on an FHP to FHP basis, but, just something to consider. If this does happen, it would look something like your sponsors fill out the form, and then it would go into basically a review section with each coordinator, who would then basically need to review all the information from the database, in the database. And there'd be, you would be a data editor. So you could, if somebody did spelling errors, you could update that. You could ask, you could ask for follow-up from folks. And then there would be kind of another level of you then submitting it to NFHP. So that is what it would look like. You would obviously have the opportunity to review the information. You might only submit to NFHP 5 of your 10 project proposals. So, that's kind of the overview of what that would look like. But there's definitely some considerations we need to take, and the amount of work, that needs to be done to make that work really well. There's also the technical support. If one of your sponsors runs into technical problems, they can ask you, but then it, as a database manager, it might end up being a question for me as well. And so we want to make sure that it's just, we're supporting your sponsors in the way that they need support. So, I just wanted to take a moment for any other considerations, about this, or you all can think about it and let me know. Jason, I see your hands up.
Yeah, Kate, I had a thought about that when you said, potentially having to create 20 of these. I wonder, because it's something that I just think would be really a game changer for the coordinators to be able to have the proposals collected that way. I wonder if there's some possibility of enough coordinators agreeing on the critical elements to where you could get it down to 5 or even 10 options. So you got 5, maybe the coastal FHPs all have some elements that the others don't have, or, I don't know what that could be, but, I don't know if this would be a great use of time at our coordinators workshop in December or not, but it seems like if you went from having to do 20 of these to having to do only 5 of them, it wouldn't take as long when we could implement this to kind of take some work off of folks. So I don't know. I don't know if the coordinators would see that as a benefit or not. I just wanted to throw that out there as an idea.
Yeah, and I do, and there is a way to basically create like a mega form where if you select, if they're proposing to PMEP, for example, there's only fields that appear for PMEP versus other FHPs. So there is a way that we can work together. It would require, you know, a lot of work up front to make sure that we have all the information that is unique to each FHP. So when I say 20 forms, it's not actually like 20 physical forms, but it's considerations for 20 different partnerships. But I agree, we could probably have some type of workshop that would get everybody on the same page and maybe standardize things a little bit. So yeah, I don't know if it's ripe for December, and I'm totally open to that, but you know, I'm also open to having another separate workshop just for this at another time. Therese?
Just, I don't know that Survey 123 will ever be able to collect enough information for the Winty reviewers. We collect so much more information, and then Winty, we have our strategic plan, and they have to say which of our goals they're meeting. But I think, as Joe was saying, just the character limits alone, I just don't see. I feel like Winty's review team kind of does the deep dive, so the NFHP board doesn't have to. So trying to use Survey 123, even though it'd be great to not have to spend, I was averaging 3 hours per project to have to enter into the NFHP database. So yeah, it'd be great to not have to do that, but to lower our character limits to just 1,000, I just don't think, I don't think what would come out of that would be useful to the review team for Winty. I don't know any way around it, honestly. So just saying that right now. God, it'd be great. It'd be great to not have to re-enter it all, but the compromise is that we're not getting enough information to really evaluate the proposals. We get 25 proposals some year and we're able to fund 3. I mean, it's just, I don't know. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think if we did have this as a form, we would probably have that mega field of the things that the board review team doesn't see.
Right.
And then the need for either the coordinator or the sponsor to distill that into something shorter. And so, the form would look a little different, but feed in, only certain fields would then feed into the main database. The rest of the fields would kind of just be for FHP specific fields to review that would not get passed on to the board review.
Yeah,
Alex?
and that would be one. Yeah, that might work. Definitely going to need to really look hard at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in and make sure I'm understanding the functionality of Survey 123 correctly. Is that I think, Kate, when we implemented this, there is a section that does allow you to attach a file. And so I'm wondering if there is some happy medium between collecting, shorter versions of specific fields and then having a file attachment where maybe trying to put it in a little box just isn't going to work. And so maybe there's a sort of a strategic mix of using those two things to allow us to collect the information. I don't know how limited you are in terms of file size with that, but just wanting to bring that into the conversation here too.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. You can attach PDF documents, maps, basically all sorts of files that are not the files you necessarily pass on to NFHP, but could be used in that type of review. Some of them you may want to pass on and some of them you might not. So there's a whole lot of possibilities. It would just require a lot of upfront thinking about it and how best to then, what the best process would be to take it from what you all need and distill it down. And, you know, do we want to put all this work, because I think it'd be great, into doing a survey 1, 2, 3 form for this purpose? You know, or do, you know, I think it's just something we should talk about, but I'm open to it and I really would like to try and make that happen, and maybe test it out next year. It was just too soon this year to do that.
And I just want to also say, we don't want to duplicate any amount of work for anyone. We are trying to make this better and less work as much as possible. So at any point, you know, your feedback is really critical to helping make this the best resource it can be. We don't want to make things more duplicative either on the coordinator or on the applicant. And so we're really looking to find that happy medium, but appreciate you all working with us and providing your feedback and thoughts kind of along the way, because this is a learning process of we've got 1 year under our belts, but I think we can continue to improve it in future years.
All right, let's keep moving so we can stay on time. So we just wanted to talk about a little bit of timing related to NFHP database. And I want a little bit of this to be a discussion, but I highlighted in red some timelines. March 31st is a deadline that we can't update. That's when the projects need to be entered into the database, need to be quote unquote submitted from the FHPs to the NFHP board by March 31st, and that's how you're submitting them. By the end of this year, a lot of this work has already been done, but I will ask that all the FHPs review their priority lists. So your list of species, habitats, FHP priorities that we use as standardized lists in the database, just to make sure that nothing is missing. Perhaps you updated your strategic plan, and so your priorities may have changed. And so we want the database to reflect your most up-to-date priorities. And so we'll just ask for that by the end of the year that you review those. They're in the database form right now. However, I'm happy to send out an Excel spreadsheet of what is in the database for you all to use, for you to review and make any changes if there are some. You know, I put end of the year so then I can update the database in January, and then there'll be a couple months for you to, you know, enter your proposed projects. You know, that's why I'm giving that deadline, so we can make sure the database is populated in plenty of time before the March 31st deadline. But, you know, just that, you know, if there's any argument that, you know, we want this done sooner because December is terrible, or, you know, if we, you know, I'm just saying kind of December in general as what I'm hoping to get from you all. And I'm hoping that won't be a heavy lift since a lot of that was already done, but just going into database entry, I think it's helpful. So then March 31st is when the proposed projects needed to be entered in the database. That is a deadline written into the ACE Act. And I just wanted to point out that March 31st is a Sunday. And so I really encourage all of you to not wait until March 30th and 31st, Saturday and Sunday, to enter your projects in the database in case you have any technical support questions, because most of us won't be working on the weekend. And just to think ahead of that deadline. And, you know, unfortunately for me, the ASAC deadline also times with when my kids' spring break is. So that last week of March, I'm managing children and work. So just for especially the new coordinators who this may be a little bit newer to, I really encourage you maybe early to mid-March to try and get those projects entered as much as you can with your whole review process. I know that's challenging, just to reduce the need for kind of last minute panic on that. And the project status update table, which is something that you all provide in the report that you give to the board in that March 31st, we can use the database to export a table of project status. And I just wanted to talk to you all about a deadline for that, because if you're entering updating project status in the database, you might be doing that until up to March 31st, but I want to make sure to have a little bit of time to work with you all to export that table in the report. So I didn't want to set a March 15th, but I'd love a little bit of a dialogue about the reality of getting your project statuses updated in the database to be able to get it done for that report. And you don't need to use the export from the database. You can create the table on your own. You're more than welcome to, but I just want to let you know the database can export most of those pieces of information. And so, you know, just a deadline to think about, perhaps mid-March, to get the project, your previous project statuses updated would be helpful. To keep moving if there aren't any questions about that. And we'll just keep the communication open about this process and, you know, keep the feedback coming. So we talked about using the survey 123 form to collect proposals. We're not going to do that this year, potential in the future. I just wanted to highlight a few different examples. And, you know, I've been speaking a lot here, so I have asked Doug and Therese, and, you know, feel free, Max and Holly, if you want to talk about JotForm. And Melissa, you know, I said Kenai uses JotForm, but I'm trying to remember if it's Kenai or Matsu now off the top of my head, so apologies if I got that wrong, but Kenai uses ForStack. Cool. So that's a new one. So I just wanted to take a moment and talk about these different ways that you can collect information. I know some people may do it with a Word document, but there are online forms that are very similar to Survey 123 that collect information. So I'm going to quickly show you JotForm just as an example, and then I'm going to have Doug and Therese just mention briefly the success they've had with WordPress Gravity forms. And then if other people want to jump in and talk about like FormStack or a different form that they use, I think it's really helpful to the new coordinators and just as a community to share that. So let me pull up where I have JotForm. So this is JotForm. You know, you'll notice.
I think you need to reshare your screen. Oh, there we go. Yeah, and if you can try to zoom in, I mean, people will generally get the gist, but thank you. That looks great.
So this is California Fish Passage Forum, JotForm. This was the FY24 proposal, and it, you know, it looks almost very similar to Survey 123. They ask project summary questions. They do try to organize information requested into the different pieces that they need. They have different options here, selecting. A lot of these are specific to their FHP, but they do have their priority species. So the metrics collected. So I just wanted to point out that this is a really great way that you can have a combination of open text and pre-populated selections, ways to drop files. I'm going through this really quickly, and the forum asks a lot of additional questions in addition to what's requested by NFHP. But I did wanted to point out, here's their budget in here, one of their budgets that they request, the one-to-one non-federal match, etc. So I don't want to spend too much time here because I'm not a coordinator. And I really wanted, just kind of a brief open discussion about what folks use, but I wrote some down. So that is JotForm. It is free up to a certain number of proposals, and then it and I'm not sure what that space limit is, but PMAP, PLCI, and the forum all have been doing pretty well with that. So PMAP uses it completely free. So it's up to you all to check that out if you're interested, but that works pretty well. Therese and Doug, do you want to talk about just briefly about WordPress Gravity Forms?
I can start it off, and then Therese can correct anything that I
Sounds
mess
good.
up. But
Sure.
Rebecca Krogman runs our database, and we operate with a WordPress website that includes our dashboard and our back end, which includes the ability for our chapters to submit applications online using Gravity Forms, and we also use Gravity Kit. The forms and the kit together cost us about $500 a year in order to implement them and use them on our website. We've already redone the request for proposals for 25 to reflect the new database. So we've built everything, and it did allow us to put text limits on certain text boxes. They were character limits, not word limits, but we're going to be able to try to keep people pretty close to what the NFHP database will allow on the number of characters in restricted fields. It'll just be pretty much a relatively seamless cut and paste from our database into the NFHP database for us, unless somebody's smart enough to figure out a way to actually transfer those files over. But I'm not anticipating we're going to be that sophisticated for this next go around. That's basically what I could tell you about how we're using it. We used the one for 24. We used our one that we had used in 22 and 23 as well. So there was a lot of changing that I had to do to stay within the word limits and all that. So I'm looking forward to having WordPress in place for 25, or if we come up with something better, having a system that's going to streamline that whole process. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Therese and see what she's got on her mind there.
Yeah, so Winty, we used, Rebecca helped me to get comfortable with Gravity Forms. So Kate, it looks a lot like JotForm as far as setting up fields and all that. We use a $59 a year version of Gravity Forms, so we don't have all the functionality that Reservoir does. My steering committee didn't want to use, you can use Gravity Forms even to have your reviewers go in and score proposals. But my steering committee didn't want to do that just because you couldn't go back and rescore a proposal if you changed your mind, after reading a few more. I will say the one thing I like about Gravity Forms over JotForm, I send once the person, they can save their application and come back and work on it later. But once they click submit, they can no longer get in, but I can send them sort of the draft of what their proposal will look like. And then if they need to make a few more changes or if something changes at the last minute, I can go in and edit their proposal. So it's not just a one and done, which I think JotForm is. But I've been really happy with it. Like Doug said, and Joe just asked, I would say we set ours up in like 2020 or 2021. That took me probably 4 or 5 hours, Joe. But editing it each year since has been like less than an hour, maybe half an hour. So I think it's worth putting the time in, and it just saves you time in the future. So yeah, I've been real happy with it, but I think JotForm would work for most people too, honestly. I don't know about Gravity Forms, Holly. Yeah. It's a plugin to WordPress. I'd have to look to see if I doubt it. You probably have to pay each year.
Yeah, I think you do. I don't know of any longer
Yeah.
license.
It's not expensive though, I don't think. I think it's worth it, honestly. And you can attach photos. We get design plans when people have them. I mean, you set the megabyte limit, but yeah, it's been great, honestly.
And I did get Matsu and Kenai mixed up. Sorry about that. But so it's Matsu that uses JotForm, but I don't know, Melissa, do you want to say anything about Stack since that is a different tool? And your answer could be no, because I'm putting you on the spot. But if you like it and you have anything positive to say, it's another option.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, it took me a second to unmute myself, but I don't mind talking about it briefly. So I have 1 year of experience using it, and the form was already set up for me when I came into this position. It does have very similar capabilities to what I'm hearing from JotForm and WordPress, and I'll say it's all completely free for me. However, I haven't looked in yet to see if there's a cap on the number of proposals that can be submitted. With our FHP, we're looking at usually typically about a dozen or less sometimes of total proposals. So that doesn't seem to be an issue for me. And yes, we can also upload, pictures and additional documents. I really like the idea of embedding a table. I'm going to look into that in the future. It seems like you can do that on FormStack, but I haven't looked into that yet. So overall, I like it. The only thing we are capped out on our free account is the number of the forms that you can have running at any given time. So I do share this account with our fiscal sponsor, and every once in a while we have to recycle forms, which it can be kind of annoying because we're capped out at 10 or 10 or 15. I forget what the max is there. So that would be my one caveat.
Cool. Thanks, Melissa. Any questions for Melissa or anybody else want to bring up a form that they use?
Has anybody tried using a Google form or considered it?
Hey Joe, it's Lori. I actually just created a Google form for our mini grant project that we're about to launch literally tomorrow. And just hearing this discussion, I'm now thinking I should sit down for a couple hours and do gravity forms. I'm a little bit panicking that I might try to use Google Forms and something about it might backfire on the whole process. So I don't know, I might be up at midnight tonight doing gravity forms instead.
Okay, thanks. I'm kind of leaning toward gravity forms too.
There is a free gravity forms too, Joe, but I don't think people can save their application and come back later, if I remember right. So I thought it was worth $60 to have that functionality.
Definitely.
And that is built as a plugin to a WordPress website, correct?
Yes.
So you would need to have, I don't know if it stands alone, if you would need to have a WordPress website, correct?
Yes, as far as I know.
Okay, so I just want to point out that nuance. JotForm does stand alone, and Gravity Forms do need to have a WordPress website. Cool.
So
Any other? Oh,
Max mentioned what it spits out, and to me that's kind of important. Like, okay, so that you've got your database, and then you have reviewers review it. Are you guys like downloading PDFs of these applications and then sharing them with the reviewers? Or are you asking them to go in, and is there a back end to these forms, or how do reviewers interact with them?
So for Gravity Forms, there is a backend that Doug can talk about that you can actually use in Gravity Forms. I have my folks log in and look at the proposals, but then we score them in a separate spreadsheet somewhere outside of Gravity Forms. But I don't recreate anything. They just go straight into Gravity Forms and look at the stuff.
Yeah, our reviewers will actually go in and do it online and I'm not sure if that's because we have the Gravity kit that makes that more seamless, but I've had no complaints about the process from our reviewers being able to do their jobs thoroughly, and they've been happy with the process.
Thanks.
And I know Max and Holly, who you know have everything set up in job form, they're new. But for PMEP, I know I'm speaking for Joan, but I did help with the design of that. And you can export like an Excel spreadsheet. You can export a PDF of the full proposal. The reviewers aren't going into job form and reviewing it that way. She is exporting everything, but I know she does really like that it comes in an Excel file, and she can kind of clean it up and make it look nice for the reviewers in whatever way she wants. And then they can also read a PDF of the full proposal, which can be quite long. But that's what I know about job form, and I've done the review and it's worked I've actually reviewed PMEP projects myself and it's worked pretty well.
We used JotForm for strategic visioning in January. Same, Kate. I was able to export a spreadsheet of every reply to every question, but then if they wanted, I could create a PDF of just one person's replies if they wanted. So we didn't use it to review projects, but you easily could.
All right. Alex is updating this slide to make sure it reflects some of this information so we can reshare it around and you can all have these resources. So just so you know, we'll have all that, but I'm glad this is a good conversation and glad we're having it before you go into your RFP season. So feel free to bring anything else up. I was going to click to the next slide, but I think this might be it for me. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I feel like we don't need to keep people on if there's no more discussion, but definitely want to open it up, given that we've got new coordinators on, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service regional folks, just to see if there are any other questions related to RFPs. I know we kind of covered a lot here, but really hope that this has been helpful to folks, just to kind of get these processes all straight. And I really appreciate the Fish and Wildlife Service folks joining today to help add that information into this process, to make sure folks are aware that this is what we've presented today, from Kate and I is mainly the NFHP side of things. That does not address what Louise and other folks have brought up during this discussion. So appreciate you guys chiming in to remind folks that there's sort of two big major pieces of this whole process. One handled at the board and FHP side, and then one handled at the Fish and Wildlife Service. But I'll open it up if anybody wants to chime in with any other questions related to funding or RFPs.
This is Sarah. I actually had one. Oh, sorry. I was rude and jumped right in, Joe.
Go ahead.
So I was curious if we have anywhere like a list of everybody's awards and like floor and ceiling of your proposals. I had put together a little spreadsheet, but I was kind of curious if we have something like that already, or if folks would be interested in seeing kind of what other folks' proposal ranges are, and when their grant rounds, when they're planning to like close their RFPs. Partly just for cross promoting too, since we can throw things to other folks sometimes.
I'm not aware of anything like that exists to pull all that information together in one place. But I could see how that would be really useful for folks as you're going in and making modifications. I don't know if anybody has gathered any of this information kind of on the side, or if other folks would find this useful. We could definitely put together a quick survey of folks to gather that all in one place and share that around.
I think it'd be useful. I'm trying to think, we've had the FHP coordinators have so many shared spreadsheets and stuff. I can't think of anyone that collects all of that. And honestly, after last year's RFP, so much of the information's changed. It'd probably be better just to start over. Yeah. Like Joe, I think Winty's will open in November and close probably mid to late January. We do our big review meeting in February, so I got to give them a time to do the review.
Okay, if I'm hearing one person or two people that would find that useful, I a third heads up from or thumbs up from Joe. So it's sounding like this could be a really quick survey to folks. So just put this, or a shared spreadsheet. Everybody just goes in and enters their information. And thanks folks for chiming in on the chat there as well. Thanks, Sarah, for the question. I think that's in relatively light lift to just ask folks to jump in and put that information in one place that can be shared.
Looks like Doug has his hand up.
Yes. Hey, I just wanted to ask a question. We had been contemplating on our RFP actually requiring them to determine whether they had a SAMS registration that was viable currently. We've had some of our small localized project folks that have gone through the whole process, and then when it comes time to actually start with when they get an award, and then they struggle to get up to speed on ASAP and SAMS registration and all that. Do any of you require that prior to even submitting a proposal, or you just have to work through that? So we had one this year that we ended up. Fortunately, we were able to let the Corps of Engineers take the money through a transfer so that we could move ahead with that project. But SAMS denied them, would not allow them a SAMS registration. They'd already been awarded money by NFHP, and they were denied a registration because they weren't a well-organized entity. So we just wanted to avoid that going forward. And I didn't know if the other folks have had problems with that, or if that's something you've considered.
Doug, Winty tells them they have to have it, but we don't check to make sure they have it.
Doug, I'll say this: there's a process currently underway to develop a small grants team at the service that will. It's largely in response to the Justice 40 initiative from the administration. It's not, as you can imagine, it's not just NFHP running into this issue, and there's a lot of issues with getting money out to some of the smaller tribes and things like that. And so they're working on a process right now. We should know something in the next couple of weeks about whether they're going to be able to fund this team and stand up this team, and their job would be to accompany these smaller, as we say, mom and pop applicants for federal funding, and help them get signed up in SAM and ASAP, and help walk them through these processes so that we don't exclude those types of folks from getting federal grants through the service.
So Jason, it sounds like if we go down this path, the applicant still has to be registered in SAMS, because I also had some issues finally this year as well. And so I've got an applicant that can't get through SAMS. And so it sounds like with this potential process, the folks would still have to get through SAMS. Is that correct?
Yes,
with some
that
assistance.
Right. And that was the first thing that group checked on, was to see if there was any way around that. And there is apparently not, I guess, due to GAO or someone like that. There's no way around using SAM, but there will be a team of people there that will be their entire job, will be to help applicants with those processes like SAM registration.
Okay.
And that would be within the WISFR Financial Assistance Office.
Okay.
That's great,
and
Jason.
I just wanted to share with everyone, I've had a lot of issues with SAMS, Grant Solutions, and ASAP this year. And it has really sucked up a lot of my time in trying to assist, because the help desks for very helpful. So yeah, certainly welcome to have any type of better support than what we have existing.
Well, cross your fingers that it gets funded.
I used to run
Okay.
a small nonprofit, several, and it's a struggle. Just keeping up with all the legal requirements. You've got to be registered in ASAP, and then you've got to have the accounting software so that you can pull your money quickly. And it's a lot for a small group, or even a lot of tribes, I think, would really struggle, to be honest. I think Debbie has her hand up.
Yeah, actually, that's really timely, Teresa, because that's exactly what I was going to say. We do have this issue, but one thing that we've found success in our partnership is we've been able to pair fiscal sponsors together. And it's been working out really successfully. We have a watershed coalition that covers all of Southeast Alaska, and they're working really closely with our tribal groups who don't have some of their granting processes in place yet. They're trying to build that capacity, but they've been able to piggyback onto one of our other partners as a fiscal sponsor. So just not sure if others have been thinking about this. Another group who's really, been doing a lot of restoration and increasing their restoration activities, especially in Alaska, is Trout Unlimited. So they can come in as a fiscal sponsor for some of your smaller partners who are really doing the bulk of the work and getting the full project together, but just needing that financial piece. And Jason, I'm excited to hear because your team will be an extra benefit to them as well.
Yes. So Joe, looks like you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's a little bit off of this topic though, so I don't want to, if we're having a good discussion, I don't want to interrupt it. Okay, I'll go. I was curious if the scoring team for the board in developing the rubric had any conversation about the number of projects that are reviewed and scored per partnership. So when the MGLP submits projects, we get, say, 15, 20 projects every year, and then we screen out some that we think aren't good projects, and then there's some that are tweeners that, if we could find funding for it, great, but we don't want to put it forward if it's going to hurt our chances of getting funding from NFHP. So we do a little bit of a calculus to try to figure out which ones we submit forward to NFHP. My understanding is that NFHP ideally would like to see more projects from partnerships to be aware of all of the demand out there, not just the demand for what those very best projects are that, each FHP thinks, put our best foot forward for the process. But there's no incentive for me to do that because I don't want to share project number 15 if it's going to, cut funding for us. So I didn't know if my assumption is that there's still this desire to get a large list of projects. And I didn't know if there was any discussion about ways to kind of standardize that to avoid that perverse incentive.
That's a good
Kate, I don't
question.
know. Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but to me, that's something that would be a great discussion for the board or, maybe the partnerships committee, even to have that conversation, because I see what you're saying. It's kind of a catch-22 in some ways. So, what would the board prefer? And if the board would prefer you to enter or to provide that larger list, what's the incentive for you to do that? So I don't know. I mean, I can't answer that.
I mean, there's never been that I've been involved the last couple of years, a discussion on like, they wouldn't want to see more than 15, there's been never been a number. Listening to their discussions, they are looking at the quality of the project. So if there are, you have some projects that aren't so great, and you reviewed them and you want to toss them out, I don't think it's beneficial just to pass them on. So I think, submitting the quality projects, but I think that would be a good question to have in terms of a limit. If you do get 15 amazing projects and it might bring down your one-to-one match overall. You know, what do we do? Do they still want to see those? Do you say 8 are for strong consideration because they get us there, and these 7 don't have the one-to-one match, but we wanted to share them with you? I'm sure we could figure out, you know, I think that's a good discussion, and I think starting with the partnerships committee would be good.
If we could, you know, I was just thinking too, Kate, from the last policy committee meeting, if we could designate those projects that Joe's talking about. The question came up from the folks who are going to go to the Hill to lobby for reauthorization, and they said, how much, what's the value of, or what's the amount that we're short right now with the current funding amount? And the only number we had was the list of approved projects, right? The 134 projects that we know we're only going to be able to fund 70 something of at best. So they said, but I brought up, I said, well, that's a minuscule portion of potential projects that are out there. It's just the FHP coordinators, there's no reason for them to submit additional projects under the current process. So I mean, I knew just from experience with the reservoir partnership that there were several more projects that, to use your term, Joe, tweeners, you know, that there's, why would the partnership submit them when there's, you know, you've already gone well past your 300,000 or whatever that you think you might get. You may be at 500,000 or 600,000, but then there's several more beyond that. What do you do with those? And so some sort of, and I say that because some sort of accounting of that might be useful, the Hill anyway, for saying, look, you know, trying to get more money for the program. I don't know. Again, I'd have to kind of pitch that to someone else or someone on the board to get their thoughts on it. Kevin's had his hand up for a while. I don't know if he's wanting to talk about this topic or something else.
Yeah, similar. I think it's kind of been talked over a little bit. Just we had that similar experience. I think it was 2 years ago where we got dinged for submitting projects that didn't meet that non-Fed match requirement. In my view, it was like, hey, here is what everybody's interested in, wants to be a part of this, can't quite get this non-Fed requirement that's new, but here's all our projects, good projects that we sent in, and we got dinged for that and graded lower because we did that. So I guess that was kind of a lesson learned last year where we didn't do that on this round of funding last year. So I am kind of curious about this topic too, being able to show the overall need and interest in these partnerships, but then at our level, having to weed it out to then be viewed in a good light by the board level in that ranking process.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, it just doesn't pay to do it right now. But I think Steve has a pretty good point there in the chat that if nothing else, just a summary of the total amount, and, you know, not have to enter everything into the database or submit it for requesting approval, but just a total dollar amount of projects that you think are at least legitimate to some extent. I mean, that would be at least a first step that would, if nothing else, inform those folks going to the Hill. Therese, looks like your hand's up next.
Yeah, what a good conversation. I think this is we really need to have this conversation with the board too, because I agree, Jason, I think showing unmet need could really help get more funding. But for Winty, you know, we guesstimate what our allocation will be each year, and we may go 150 over that, and then nobody else gets submitted, even if they're excellent. It's partly
Right.
just don't want to get dinged, and now I don't want to do all that work in the database. But yeah, excellent points. Excellent points.
Yeah, Doug, what are your thoughts?
I don't want to be Mr. Obvious, but the first sieve that we had this year was, did they meet those 5 essential requirements? And if they didn't, we did not submit them.
Yeah, you would. It seems as though. Sorry, Kate. I was just going to say, it seems as though you would, if you were submitting just a number from the FHP, a dollar amount, you would need $1. Here are all the projects that did meet those 5 things that we didn't submit because we were already at $500,000 or $600,000 worth. And then, oh yeah, here's this other pile of potential projects that have been submitted. You know, here's the other total amount from the other projects that were submitted that didn't meet the 1-to-1 or whatever, but we still think might be good projects.
One thing we could do is set up a form that asks 5 simple questions: the project name, the sponsor, how much money they're requesting, and maybe an open text field about, you know, I don't know, we'd have to think about it a little bit more, but allow you to submit those projects, and but they wouldn't go into the full database, but they would just be there as a record. Like if we didn't have to worry about the OnetoOne match, we would submit this, or, you know, it's an excellent project, and they could just be flagged on a list without having to enter all the required things, the ACE Act considerations, because I know that is a lift. We could talk about doing that this year if you all are interested, and perhaps that would just populate a list for the board to be able to actually see. You know, maybe think on that and let us know what you think, but happy to try and collect that as an example this year.
I think that would be very timely right now too, with the policy committee planning Hill visits in 2024 to collect that information if the coordinators are interested in you know, it's just one more thing, but hopefully it's something in the end that will result in getting some more funding.
Great. Well, are there any other questions? I believe this meeting we're going a little bit over, so respect for everybody's time, but this has been great. Is there anything else folks want to bring up today?
Hi,
Jessica.
I would have one if anybody wanted to hang out, but I was just curious. Matsu is in the process of updating our RFP, and as part of that, we're looking at updating our FHP priorities for that RFP. And so I was just curious what other fish habitat partnerships, if anyone has a good system, or what others are doing, and particularly if they think they have a good process for updating their priorities annually for their RFP, I'd be interested to hear. Yeah, I don't know if it's helpful, but for us, you know, some years they've been more involved. We have a symposium and we get feedback from our partners at our science conference. We work with our science and data committee, and then steering committee has a discussion. So some years it's more robust, some it's more the steering committee makes a decision. But Joe, were you gonna make a comment?
Yeah, only because there was silence. I don't feel like we are in the category of doing it well. But what I mean, it mostly rests on me, and I sit down with all of the different places where that information is going to go eventually. The Fish and Wildlife Service project agreement forms, the NFHP database, and then our own information needs for assessment. And I kind of, do it myself, and then I send it around for thoughts and feedback. So maybe not the best way to do it, but I'm the only paid person on our steering committee, so it comes to me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you.
You know, I think it's an interesting question, and I'm not the PMEP coordinator, but I'm PMEP's data steward, and I sit on those. And I think FHP's, for PMEP, we have our strategic plan priorities that last 3 to 5 years. And then we have an annual work plan that changes. But PMEP's priorities actually stay the same kind of longer term, on a more longer term basis. And then we have an annual work plan working towards those priorities, where those basically kind of strategic actions change annually. But that's not what, Joan is adding into the database as their priorities. So, but annually at our annual meeting, which we're having in a couple weeks, we will work on those work plans and how we're going to work towards those priorities. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I know that that's how PMEP views it, and allows us to maybe stay high level, but then work towards annual objectives that we can then shift and modify based on a variety of different, maybe funding opportunities or situations that come up or expertise. Don't know if that's helpful, but.
No, it is. Yep. Yeah, thank you. Great. Yeah, and we have something, we actually do have something similar, that we have our larger strategic action plan that, like you said, 3 to 5 years. And then we have a, it's more of an organizational focus or organizational priorities document, which gets updated every 2 years. So yeah, there are certainly guiding documents. I think it was just more interesting. Like, I just was like, oh, I wonder what the different processes are at these steering committees make these decisions. This is curious. They're doing it. So thanks.
Yeah, great question. Great. Anybody else have something they want to bring up, or I think we're all looking forward to seeing each other in person in December. So just remember, Charleston's coming up. That agenda is being developed. So keep all these discussions in mind. And I think there's also going to be open opportunities for discussion. So it's pretty exciting. I'll pause, take any last minute questions, or Jason, if you want to add anything before we say goodbye. Nope, all good. Thanks, everybody. We'll be circulating materials. I believe this is being recorded. We'll send the presentation and all of the associated materials for the database. And soon we'll be able to send you those forms for what the board will be using to review. So just keep your eyes open for that. But thank you all for participating and your great questions. And we'll see you all, if not before, at the board meeting in a couple weeks, virtually.
Yep.
At the board meeting. All right.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. Great meeting.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.